is that the name on your degree doesn't really matter. People who have advanced degrees, masters, PhDs, some of them are struggling to find jobs in this market. There is a massive change happening in labor market criteria. So let's talk about some jobs that are not going to be displaced.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Today we are talking DeepSeek and a bunch of other things recently updated in tech. Quick reminder to find us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. So Lakshay, I'm going to kick it over to you first. What is deep research?
Yeah, so a couple of days ago, OpenAI released something called Deep Research. This is built into ChatGPT. What it kind of allows you to do is you can give a prompt, and the sort of thing you'd expect like a longer term, like almost news journalism report to be compiled as. It will go ahead, take your prompt, understand generally what you're asking for, what sort of shape you need that information in, and it will go ahead, jump around the internet, use all of its long-term reasoning models, taking something like 10 to 16 minutes, and compile for you a full report. That's the concept. Damon went ahead, and for the sake of this podcast, we kind of use that as a premise to see what we could talk about, like what's happening in AI tech news. I'd be curious, Damon, as to how you saw it did, because you were the person playing with it the most.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think first thing is it's very impressive. Like it does kind of exactly like what we thought a true AI agent, quote unquote, would do. So you kind of give it a task, you send it off in the background, it spins for minutes. I think the longest kind of analysis I had it run was roughly 18 minutes, somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. And it kind of comes back with this, fairly comprehensive, analysis from kind of what you asked for it. And so I had it kind of summarize the recent updates in technology, and that kind of span from the kind of very obvious, which is Stargate and these kind of massive AI investments, all the way down to some things that I thought were fairly interesting, which was like some recent mergers and acquisitions in like biopharma, as an example, some new non-opioid painkillers, right? Which maybe have a massive impact on people dealing with pain management or those kind of things. And so I think kind of again just overall impressed with the breadth of this and kind of the thoroughness at which it kind of really tried to answer my questions. Also, I think probably because of the influence of DeepSeek and otherwise, OpenAI has kind of gone the extra mile in allowing users to kind of peer under the hood a little bit with what this model's doing. So not only does it kind of outline its chain of thought of, okay, Damon as a user is asking for X, and in order to accomplish X, I'm going to go through these steps, but it also kind of gives you a running ledger, if you will, of the steps it's taking. So it's going out and sourcing information from Reuters, or it's going out and searching Wikipedia, or it's going out and searching, the New York Times or this scientific journal, or kind of whatever the case is. I tried it a couple of different things. I tried it kind of like high level. I think people that listen to this podcast know I do science, so I had it asking about a couple of scientific concepts to see if it could get around some of the paywalls. That that's a concern that we've had many times with our scientific tool is authors who would have access to these journals can't access the full text of those articles with the large language models because of paywalls, et cetera. Also had it doing some financial and stock analysis. Also had it doing some future prediction for the upcoming Super Bowl. So very topical, very happy to kind of go into any of that. I will say I found some critical shortcomings of it. So happy to launch into there, but we'll give Shashi a time to react to any of that.
Let's talk about why Google's deep research and now OpenAI's deep research matter. They use a lot more tokens. They're going to use a lot more energy and compute time, and they're going to create a more finished product. Why does that matter? Right now, analyst jobs, data entry jobs, paralegal jobs, these are all they're still jobs that humans do, and they can use AI to augment their jobs if they're savvy. Many people in those industries are not even using AI, but those that are savvy are using AI tools to help them do their job more effectively. A tool like deep research, and maybe not even this iteration, maybe 2 iterations from now, will do the job that those humans are doing better than they could possibly do them. And so the trajectory we're on is job displacement, and deep research is an early entree in seeing how that job displacement is going to happen, what AI needs to do, meaning larger context windows, more compute time, and fundamentally more cost that goes into searching the web, traversing down a series of links iteratively. All of those things are going to create increased compute cost, but it's going to result in a better AI product that more clearly and obviously displaces the need for human analysts. Analysts at companies like Deloitte and Accenture, these are jobs that will obviously be center of the bullseye. Their customers aren't going to need them for many of those current jobs. They're going to be able to use a tool, maybe not this iteration of deep research, but a couple from now, to easily do the work of those people. That labor cost will translate into a cost for the OpenAI or Google Gemini subscription provider.
I think one thing that I have, for the record, I haven't yet played with this thing. Like, we got the subscription and I haven't tried it at least. The thing that I have heard generally, so Google also announced Gemini Flash. That's a thing that happened this week. I imagine we'll talk about it a little bit later. But just fundamentally with these models, the thing that they can't do super well is getting like more structured content out in the correct shape. So if we were to say, like, I need deep research to go read a bunch of FTC filings, I want to read like investment reports, the thing that like it's kind of prone to messing up is, what the hell does this table say, right? The semantic model will look at this table, try to just garner like, that's a table, looks like line goes up. I'll throw some numbers in there because there's probably numbers in there from what I can see. And it can mess up the details really, really easily. So I think for right now, my assumption, again, without having played with it, is that these tools, like these deep research tools, they aren't going to be able to get you quantitative stuff yet. Qualitative reporting feels trivial. Like if you're just reading off the web and reading like raw text from New York Times or whatever it may be, no problem. But if you're going to have to go to a quantitative job, which has like data that comes into its role, I think that's further away.
Yeah, that's matched my lived experience too. And again, I've only been playing with these tools for, going on 72 hours now, and these things are obviously brand new. And I think as of this morning, it was just now released to the entirety of pro users. But you said it correctly, in both the ingest and the output of anything that is non-text based, it just really struggles with still. And I'll even go further to say one of the critical shortcomings that I identified pretty easily was it sometimes got lazy in its citation of sources, which we know has been a crux or kind of a Achilles heel of these large language models for the duration of their existence, essentially. But instead of sometimes pointing to a web page, it would give you a dead link, or it may just default to, rather than giving you the actual article on Reuters, it would just give you Reuters.com, right? Or like Bloomberg.com versus the actual article, which is, not really all that useful. Touching on your point, Josh, I think you're correct in saying that there will be job. I want to be careful not to use the word displacement. I don't know that it will be displacement so much as it will be shuffling, meaning I don't think that humans will continue to do the things that they've done, especially in the professions that you kind of correctly identified there, like any sort of analyst, market research, etc. Financial, whatever. That said, these things still need a good deal of babysitting. They're still very prone to being more or less effective based on the kind of influence of the prompt and how you can kind of help guide it down a path. So I do think, similar to how we saw, these kind of technological trends have played out throughout history, I think you're going to have the same number or probably even more people working with these AI tools, such that some of the reports that we're seeing out of, like, the Y Combinator's and folks that kind of really invest in these things heavily, is that they're seeing more demand for engineers to work on these systems, and granted, some of those are in AI research rather than less. Which I think that when we start thinking about what large language models are good at, it's analysis and it's coding. So I think, to me at least, the jury is still out whether or not we're going to see a job reduction in this, or if we're just going to get a dramatic shift of what used to be a job that was primarily at the keyboard, searching the internet and compiling a report into a Word doc or a PowerPoint, now becomes doing the same thing, but using AI to do it as your thought partner, as your kind of round the clock, surveillance machine.
We used to have this agreement as a society that you would grind through school, you'd memorize a bunch of nonsense that you're never going to use. You would get through your tests, you would get good scores in exams, you'd get into a school, hopefully a good college, you'd get degrees, and that would set you up for a successful career, a successful life. That is dissipating. That is no longer how the job market is operating anymore, and that pace is going to accelerate. And so what we're seeing is that the name on your degree doesn't really matter. People who have advanced degrees, masters, PhDs, some of them are struggling to find jobs in this market. There is a massive change happening in labor market criteria. So let's talk about some jobs that are not going to be displaced. If you're a tradesperson, if you're a plumber, electrician, if you do flooring and roofing, that stuff is not in the realm of what AI is going to do. Now we could talk about robotics later, but there's going to be some delay between the revolution of AI and the introduction of robotics into everything. For what we're talking about now, the visible future, AI is not displacing those hands-on trades. It will displace non-top level jobs. So if you're a paralegal and you work in a law firm and you support 2 or 3 lawyers with a bunch of administrative tasks, AI is there are too many smart people working to solve your job and replace your job with technology that it's not going to happen. We can argue about whether that's a year or 2 or 3, but there are so many. You mentioned Y Combinator, and Y Combinator is just one piece of that puzzle. There are many, many companies out there trying to displace every one of these non-top jobs that it's inevitably going to happen. So what you're describing, Damon, is I think in a way a wishful thinking scenario that these people are going to re-educate themselves to operate in a different way. I think many people are not equipped or ready for that kind of complete re-education to do a different job or to do their job in an entirely different way. I'm not seeing that kind of adaptability in the market, in the labor market. So some other jobs that won't be displaced, jobs that require a lot of hands-on work with other human beings. Those feel like difficult to replace. Creative jobs, artist jobs. We have AI tools that will help with art, but ultimately art is about taste and human preference. And if you see 2 paintings and one you were told was created by AI and one was by human, there's inherently more value, more intrinsic value in the art created by the human. So that's my view. I think it's a bit wishful thinking that the entire labor market will adapt that quickly.
I mean, there's part of this that's to me just like ChatGPT has existed for 2 or 3 years. And I think there's also an element to this, which is I think what I see is that like the top 10% of productive people who found this thing and are able to use it are having outsized effect on how they perform at their job, how much they're able to get done, that sort of thing. But the kind of like majority truth, I think in a lot of cases that like the simple education of what you can do with this stuff isn't generally there, right? There was not to hop too many topics, but I think the first instance of a university program rolling out ChatGPT EDU to the entire student body as like the professors can make custom GPTs and students can go ahead and use those, right? We're a little bit out of cycle in that there are probably undergrad students right now who are like LLM native users, right? Their productivity tool is not a Google Drive. It's not a Microsoft Word. Their productivity tool is what ChatGPT is. And I think it's the biggest thing that's going to make it take a while for that influence to spread across the market is how long it takes for that education to reach the workforce. At least in my experience, it's felt like the typical person is not aware of what you can do with this stuff. And we're immersed in this space, right? But the typical person has not heard of deep research or knows what O3 mini is or has any reason to care about what a reasoning model is. And that's just so far away that the people who are aware will probably get very, very ahead. The people who aren't will be lagging for a couple of years until they're like virally made aware of the things you can pull off with this thing.
I just think that most of these technology shifts, and your points are well taken, Shashi, but most of these things manifest in ways that are difficult to predict. And like take the paralegal example, and if we wanted to forecast what does that job shift look like in a world that is AI native, and the duties that that person was fulfilling on a daily basis are no longer necessary, you could imagine data labeler, right? Workflow optimizer, those kind of things, where it's like you're actually just doing the things that you were doing before, but instead of doing them for kind of a senior executive or something, you're doing them to train the AI workflow for your interfirm practice or your interfirm practice. Like I think that you're correct in saying that the jobs that are currently exist will be kind of displaced in a manner of speaking. But I don't know that I believe fully that we're going to see a precipitous decline in the number of employees. For example, yes, there are going to be people on the edges that kind of lose their job because the core competency they currently have is no longer required or necessary. I think that is inevitable. But I think it's difficult for me to fathom that this transition will be larger than the transition from humans being primarily farmers as the primary occupation to the primary occupation being white collar desk jobs, right? And so like I just don't know how those two things translate. And maybe I am wrong, and we end up with you know unemployment rates which we've kind of never seen. But I guess I'll hold out optimism, like you said, but that isn't really going to be the case.
Yeah, I just think there's a lot of inertia. The thing I feel like I view in general is that like the companies that cause these sort of like macro level changes, right? The way that Google operates, the way Goldman Sachs operates, whatever kind of determines the industry trend for what happens and spreads out to medium and smaller size businesses. I think there's just so much incumbency dependence, right? The thing that I look at is Cursor has been a thing for something like a year and a half now. Great product, really, really useful, changes the game, all that sort of stuff. But companies like working with GitHub because Microsoft is a more known entity. And it's taken Microsoft all of those 1.5 years to finally come up with their answer to the agentic problem, right? It's that's going to take like so long to just like bleed out into actual the startups of the world who are trying to change a lot of things can make a big dent at like from the bottom level up, but the macro level changes happens from the top down, and those top down people are just so slow.
I saw these X posts on X.com about people comparing Cursor and Windsurf and kind of pros and cons and like different ways of using those two tools. And then like fourth or fifth in the comments is like some dude that's like, "Hey, how about Microsoft GitHub Copilot? Like, can we get this in the comparison?" And everyone's like, "Oh God,
It's so terrible. I tried it once after like a
me
full
too.
like
It's so
half
bad.
year of coding with Cursor. Microsoft Copilot, it's awful. It's
So
crazy.
bad."
Like
That's
that's the
not to say
thing.
Cursor is great, right? Like,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I go in
absolutely.
circles with Cursor and get really frustrated that like, I mean, I must be running out of like my fast queries or high context queries or whatever. And then I get to a point where it's just like it's trying to do the same thing over and over in a really bad way, and then
Yeah.
deleting the thing it did 5 minutes ago. And like, clearly, I've like exhausted your query count, and you've stuck me on the crappy model.
hmm The thing that happened to me recently is with Cursor, I so while building a product like we use a friend library that cares that like the code is written in a certain way. And so instead of me going ahead and caring that like, oh, as the code is being written, I'm going to go back and fix all these like errors in compilation. Once my feature is done, I know it's generally working, I'll go to Cursor and I say like, run this command, fix the issue you see, and loop until done. And I just kind of let it go and do its thing because I generally was trusting it. I pushed my code up, merged it to main, was testing in prod the night before I wanted to launch the thing, and my feature was gone. And I was looking at the logs. I was like, no, I think the thing we should do to fix your feature and the typing error is just replace your entire implementation. Which is like,
Oh my
why?
God. Me too.
Why?
I had a database. It was like I was using Supabase, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh no, I'm just gonna make a new database. I'm gonna use Postgres on local and like do everything local and just make a whole new schema. Like, no, I had a schema. Like, just use the thing.
Out of curiosity for both of you, because these are not tools that I've used in my coding workflow. Most of mine is just dialogue with Claude or like O1 Mini as an example in the ChatGPT interface. Why do you think that is? Why do you think those experiences? Do you think it is the lack of context? Do you think it's just simply that you're trying to do something slightly outside of the mainstream? Like why is it getting these things kind of hilariously wrong in certain instances?
When I think of like when we started Scholar AI, it was to alleviate some of the obvious shortcomings of ChatGPT at the time. and provide validated references and real papers, not hallucinated papers. And it sort of feels like now that game is like moved to Cursor, where Cursor does all these obviously stupid things sometimes, and the game is like optimizing your use of Cursor, and then Cursor will get better, like, so some company will spend a whole lot of cycles trying to write code to solve all those problems the Cursor's getting wrong, and then Cursor will get better in the next iteration, and all those companies will just be wiped because the code that they spent all that time writing is now trash, essentially. So it feels like that game, and we don't want to play that game. Like we don't want to build like Cursor side tools to improve the edge functionality of Cursor, but somebody will, and then Cursor will make a better version. So I think I'm kind of just holding out hope for better models and improvements in Cursor. I'll probably try Windsurf just to, like, I don't know, see if I have a better overall experience. But yeah.
Yeah, but I think that gets at the core of like why I look at what's happening with AI as just generally such a slow thing. Where like you and I, Shashi, like we're technical by background. We can generally know like what is a bad choice that it's making. But like an AI native like market, an AI native like economy doesn't generally have that awareness, right? If I were to dump deep research on someone and say like, hey, can we go ahead and like print out my like stock report so I can turn this to my manager and my at like my big consulting firm will have reports about how you save your business, and it's getting like tables wrong and someone isn't aware of how to catch that, then it's not an effective product yet. That would be reason to be like, oh, we can't keep using deep research, just do this manually. We can only trust if it's manual. And that gets pushed off another year until some bigger model solves that problem.
Yeah, I
I've
think
heard
that
of these. Okay, so I'm curious about your take on this. Okay, so
Hey, man.
I've heard about PE, private equity companies, going in
Mm-hmm.
and buying traditional businesses
Mm-hmm.
and then doing this exact thing that you're describing, which is basically like retrofitting the organization with AI, with sometimes different staff who are already kind of trained to use tools, rather than trying to get the legacy people to
Mm-hmm.
incorporate new tools, which in many cases that's very hard to do.
Yeah.
I'm curious of your take. Do you think that approach works, or do you feel like it's doomed to failure in some way?
I think it's really smart. I think the problem you run into is just like deal flow. Like you need like I imagine quite a bit of experience and like enough cycles of trying this like AI retrofitting thing to actually get something that's working. And ultimately, if the business you're acquiring is like profitable, you're fine. But in the case of like bringing in the right people who know how to retrofit a thing and actually getting it up to the accuracy standard that's needed, um, I think a lot of these companies are just praying for the next model to any AI startup is praying for the next model to solve all their problems. Because ultimately there's just like so much that's like so context specific. That again, like a financial report, getting the table correct is a really hard thing to do. Like getting the decimal point in the right spot is a really tough thing for an LLM like visual model to do, right? But that's something that could like blow up the entire capacity for that like transaction or system to work. I think if you go into something qualitative, like if you go into like again, I think like all these companies that do like offshoring work, like trying to improve like I guess like turn around very simple work products for bigger clients. I think there you can do a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot of money to be made if you're just gonna have like a acquire and rotate in AI sort of thing. But I think looking at like the high, like obvious things that like you would probably see someone apply to Y Combinator to, I think you're going to struggle a little bit.
yeah, I think to me it feels a little bit like trying to skate to where the puck is going, which I think generally is a smart strategy. I think that AI can't accomplish a lot of this kind of blocking and tackling that's necessary right now, but the hope is, and we're hearing this out of many groups, Y Combinator included, that we talked about a couple times now, where the next model release, all of a sudden a bunch of things that weren't working suddenly start to work. And if you're positioned in the correct space, you have the customers, you have the workflow, you understand the processes kind of beginning to end, you can be in a really good position to then capitalize on those efficiency gains. I guess the other thing that is true still, and we talked about it briefly last week with the introduction of DeepSeek and kind of the shockwaves that sent through the capital markets, is for all the capex and the dollars that have been dumped into AI, so far those things aren't returning positive ROI results, right? Even from the model providers are losing money on these things. Sam Altman has been kind of widely documented as saying they're losing money on a lot of the pro subscription plans, even at $200. per month. And, Microsoft and otherwise, they're not monetizing these in a way that is truly ROI positive to their bottom line yet. And I think the PE folks that you're describing are looking to do a similar thing. They're looking to scoop up those dental practices and kind of ride the long tail of efficiency gains as these AI models progress through the various stages of competency.
I'd love to shift gears. This is a really natural shift to Palantir as one of the biggest AI application layer firms out there. The reason why this is topical is that Palantir its stock price has increased about 65% in the last month. So it's gone from $70 stock to $115 stock. So it's interesting in several fronts. As a pure financial bet, it's got a PE ratio, a price to earnings ratio of 613, super high. Right? You can get Google at like 25 PE right now. So a 600 times earnings, meaning if you take their current year earnings and hold it, you get fully paid in 615 years. so Palantir is on the prima facie like a pretty expensive stock right now. Just a bit of detail. So founded in 2003. Its name is it's from the Lord of the Rings. It's from where the Seeing Stones provide vision. It's got three primary products. It's got a product that's for government called Gotham. It's for the defense sector to utilize technology, AI, to accomplish government aims, including military aims. It's got a product called Foundry, which is their commercial-facing platform, and it's got a product called Apollo, which is a continuous delivery deployment infrastructure product. Okay, so this is application layer. This lives above the foundation model, but they do, I believe they do produce their own models as well. Why is the stock popping? The stock is popping because there's presumption that one, DeepSeek and other large language model releases are going to drive down the cost of models. So if models are super cheap, where does the value go? The value goes into the application layer. Palantir has a really great position at the application layer for Fortune 500 companies and for governments. They recently met with Saudi Arabia, for example, for the possibility of a big contract. So it's a really interesting company at a really interesting place in terms of their stock price. Would love to hear your reaction to either the value of the company's stock or the bet generally on kind of the layer above the foundation model.
Damien, you go
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, happy to start. Again, I feel compelled to interject here that this is not financial advice in any way, and make sure to make that very clear. But
Smooth.
Palantir, candidly, has been a stock that I've been watching for some time, and for me, the thing that gives me pause has nothing to do with the business itself. It's more so that I can't understand, because of the nature of some of the contracts they have with the government, what exactly they're selling, what exactly their unique value proposition is to some other incumbents. The bull case for Palantir, as I see it, is that they have incredibly sticky customers. Now, not to dive too far into the political regime for the sake of this conversation, but given the increased effort in making government more efficient in the United States, that potentially puts firms like Palantir, who sell directly to the government, in a bit of a conundrum. Are they going to have some of their contracts canceled? Are they going to have contracts renewed? That kind of thing. I think, to me, there's still some wide unknowns. There feels to me like, compared to other firms that might be supplying government contracts, Palantir is largely safe and therefore could be a good bet. Shashi, you did a great job of outlining the business fundamentals. I think purely just stacking it up against something like Google or otherwise, it makes it challenging, I think, to invest at the current state. All that said, it feels like this company is in no obvious decline as far as acceleration, and that their market dominance, if you want to call it that, with specificity in the app layer and serving governments, it feels like that's going to put them in a very strong pole position going forward. So I continue to watch this company. I think I'm of equal minds to purchase it and to not purchase it. And so far, I have not ended up kind of owning any shares of Palantir, but it's continued to be one that I watch very closely because it continues to do well. And Moshe, I'll kick it to you for just kind of overall thoughts on AI and the app layer and kind of, where the value might be accrued.
For the record, I'm like generally pretty unaware of this subject. I'm reading articles live right now, just trying to understand. Um, I guess like the thing I'm trying to interpret for myself, just saying here, and this is an open question for either of you to answer. Why is a bet on Palantir not just a general bet on cloud? Like why is it different from a bet on Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, that sort of thing?
Speaking
They've
for
got a deeply
me,
ingrained position with their customers. So basically, their customers are going to them to help them solve these problems. They've
Okay,
got relationships at Fortune 500, and they've got great relationships with government agencies. So they're embedded. They're a preferred provider, and they have kind of the technology edge as a company.
I,
interesting. Yeah,
I would
go
agree
ahead,
with all
Ben.
that, except for maybe the last point. I think what my comment was earlier is that it's unclear to me whether they have a technology edge or not. And Lakshay, your question kind of tees up the unknown for me that I probably poorly articulated in my dialogue. Is that I can't understand exactly what Palantir is offering the government that is unique and therefore valuable compared to what its would be competitors would be if that is AWS or not. And so like I think it in some ways a bet because of the general, kind of necessary secrecy that surrounds government contracts is that Palantir has a technological edge. And again, I'm of neither
Yeah.
mind of whether they
So
do
let
or
me let
don't,
me
but it
detail
feels
this just
unknown.
a slight bit
Yeah.
more. So early in my career, I worked on um, a shared project with Palantir, and in the defense space. Palantir, since their early days, has developed an ontology, a proprietary ontology for organizing lots of data. They've spent a lot of time and capital doing that. Early on, this helped them with things like visualization of data, and with unstructured data, this can be really helpful. So they do have some proprietary technology. We can debate whether you could infer an ontology now, or how easily that is to replicate. Perhaps it's easier to replicate than ever before with something like a deep research tool. But for at least the time being, having an ontology that they've devoted a whole lot of time to is at least a layer of information that's non-public.
Do you think, given that, it sounds kind of like you're an overall bull on it? Again, I kind of said I'm kind of equal minds. Do you feel like you have
Yeah.
a particular lean one way or the
Yeah.
other?
So for transparency purposes, I'm an investor in Palantir. I own a significant piece, and I'm thrilled that it's going up. I'm also a little worried that it's getting into kind of meme stock territory. A 600x PE multiple is pretty crazy, and so I'm a little worried that it's kind of in this boomer bust zone. I hope its ideas and initiatives come true. You've probably seen Alex Karp, the CEO. Um, he's witty. He's energetic. He's got a lot of things to say. He was on an interview and believed to be kind of popping us in while he was kind of on a bullish heater. So there's a lot of enthusiasm that seems to be coming out of the leadership at Palantir. And I wouldn't doubt that they're going to crush it in terms of government. I feel like that's just yes. So to answer your question, yes, I'm a bull. The government space, I think they're going to crush it. The Fortune 500 space will completely come down to how much pressure those companies feel to adopt AI to stay ahead of competition. And that competition is not going to come from people in the Fortune 500. It's going to come from insurgents, startups, mid-sized companies that are very aggressively trying to grow. That's the real competition. So that's the part that I don't know.
The thing that has been weird to me just in going to OpenAI Dev Day and just like watching these companies generally is in a typical sense, like one of these companies would hold one part of the layer, right? And if you asked 2 years ago, like ChatGPT was a provider company. They were an API that was research backed, but you could query them and build applications off of them. And once ChatGPT took off, they became an app company. Once businesses started wanting to use ChatGPT, they suddenly became like a consultancy to some extent, where OpenAI, most of their money that's very, very revenue generating comes from enterprise contracts with Pfizer, with governments, that sort of stuff. Um, And so I guess in just like analyzing the layers of things, I look at this news and my gut immediately reacts with like, isn't this also competing with OpenAI? Isn't this also competing with Anthropic? Isn't this also competing with Google? And then follow up question like, what aren't those three trying to compete with? Unless you just assume purely verticalized solutions.
My underlying belief. So I'll give the bull case. My underlying belief is that companies like Google and OpenAI and DeepSeek will continue to produce models that are more and more intelligent, have longer context windows, allow more chain of thought, more cycles to run when needed, when helpful, and will add tools. But I think where the line ends up forming is in the information that's personalized to each customer. And that's where a layer like Palantir, who deeply knows their customer, in this case has a customized ontology for each customer and understands the data structure, how it works together, and what the customer's end goals are. That layer, I think, will be distinct from OpenAI and Google and DeepSeek because there's just not enough bandwidth for someone at OpenAI to embed themselves deeply at each of these customers to truly solve the problem at that layer. So I believe that will be the case, but I think there will be many other companies too that have customer specific data and advantage that will be able to build on top of these models. And they're going to compete with each other. And then there are going to be small service providers that will also be competing.
Generally agree with everything. They're volleying a question to you in response to that. There seems to be this emergence of building for yourself, right? Like your kind of AI app layer for your internal use case, for your company, that kind of thing. Do you think that kind of simultaneously eats away at the app layer, kind of the value that would be regularly accruing to what would traditionally be the SaaS businesses as well? Because again, I think that Palantir may be in a class of its own, but as you start to think about other AI companies, if you were going to take a bet on an AI app, understanding that customer, logically no one's going to be able to understand the customer as well as the customer might, right? So even if it's true that the app and the model layer separate, do you see a massive opportunity for providers to overcome that build versus buy dilemma when it does seem like momentum is
Mm-hmm.
building on the build side? Not to be redundant with the
Yeah,
choice of
it's a
words
really
there.
good
Yeah.
question, Damon. I'll go back to my early days in software engineering. I had several jobs where I worked for organizations that were building homegrown CRM and ERP tools. And at the time, those weren't even really acronyms that people thought of. That people just built tools in-house for their needs. And then over time, when you could start to buy a really good general purpose ERP or a general purpose CRM, you wouldn't have to home grow your own. You could kind of tweak it on the margins. And so I think it's really healthy that that companies are investing in their own in-house tools. I think the natural trajectory of that will be that there will be really good off-the-shelf tools that will do 90% of it, and your in-house team will be implementing and then customizing. It's a lot like software engineering. When I came out of school, excuse me, when I came out of school, software engineering was sitting at the keyboard typing out all of your code. Now the art of software engineering is much more integrating components and making those components work well together rather than kind of from scratch building each piece of it. So I see a natural trajectory from in-house build toward off-the-shelf buy, and it's going to happen as the tools get better underneath.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, yeah, I think on the one hand, it'll be interesting to see if that lived experience is repeated. Meaning, like you get these kind of superficial, highly generic app layers, app AI layers that are coming up. People begin to build bespoke solutions as the AI service providers are able to understand more and more of those particular nuances. Those tools will get better and better, and things like you might see a new rendition of Agent Force, kind of the AI evolution of Salesforce versus kind of these mini one offs at each one of these things. Um,
Sorry, Agent Force makes me laugh. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily overall bullish on Salesforce as a general kind of consensus, but it is, I think, interesting to see these places, the service providers like Salesforce that have very high margin businesses, extreme stickiness, kind of react to this shifting landscape. I think the jury's still out to see whether or not they'll be successful in doing so or what. But Lex, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Have you gotten to play around with any of Google's newest models yet at all? The new Gemini Flash or
No,
anything?
only in conversation. I think the thing I'm excited to hear, and this is maybe getting a little too techy for what we generally talk about, but the if anyone knows who's listening knows what RAG is, it was this big thing. It was a really, really big thing for a while about just like how you feed relevant information into a model. And it's this whole long-winded thing about like, oh, how do you know what part of a document is relevant? How do I know like which documents to then retrieve from? All that sort of stuff. And Google's newest model, Gemini Flash 2.0, it has kind of upended a lot of the RAG conversation because the typical person is not interacting with like that many documents at a given moment. Gemini can hold 2 million tokens. That's a really like abstract phrase, but like that's like probably a significant number of like encyclopedias worth of information dumped into that sort of space. And not only that, but it's just really, really good at getting information out of really long form context. So it kind of killed RAG, is what it's kind of sounding like is happening, where there's so many of these startups where their whole thing was like, oh, we're going to help you read from tables. Every like cloud provider, there's a number of startups that are helping you like extract information from long form documents. And the consensus that seems to be appearing is Gemini Flash 2.0 is like basically good enough, like 0.86 like average accuracy, or like 86% average accuracy with like a standard deviation of like 14 in either direction, compared to like what I think the primo startup doing this thing is, which is 90% accuracy with like 8 plus or minus. And you're getting a big company all of a sudden like not big launch, not something that like really captures the imagination like a reasoning model does, but is like very, very, very practical for most use cases and really impactful in that way, and does a good job. Like of all the hype that we're kind of talking about that's present here, it's probably one of the most like subtle, simple things that will actually make a very significant dent in like what is the application space of AI and what model is actually making an effect really immediately.
Yeah, I read somewhere somebody said um, the following, which I think is a fairly kind of concise way of capturing the pitfalls of RAG, and that it doesn't RAG promises to return you the most relevant and important chunks. What it actually does is it presents to you the most semantically matched chunks,
Mm-hmm.
and that may or may not be of heightened relevance. And so it does feel like a more thorough solution is just massive context window, give me everything, and then go find the thing that I actually care about versus trying to parse it before you actually load it in. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
I'm seeing people really liking Flash. I haven't played with it myself, so I was curious to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah, with the I mean, so my minor announcement. We're building a new product that's more oriented towards students and educators, and in there is a very critical piece, which is like you can upload your class materials and you can talk with them and interact with them, that sort of thing. And I spent a good while over the last weeks building like the RAG engine for this thing, where hey, I care that like there's really smart processing about how this document gets converted into minor chunks and that those are all semantically searchable. And now I'm just sitting here just like I'm storing the full document anyway. I know what all is relevant to one class, and the token cost is just going down. That I could probably just trust that like model caching, all this sort of stuff that's coming out to reduce price. I could have just ignored that feature, and all of a sudden, like the capacity to make this tool good at like developing a comprehensive report over the book you were supposed to read or whatever it may be is super, super easy. And a lot of startups, the vast majority of like smaller businesses in the space that aren't like hype startups are consultancies where all they're doing is like taking what a ChatGPT is. They're taking what an LM tool is and going and home brewing that for someone in some private space. And Gemini Flash presumably just gave them like close to one cheat code for part of that problem.
Excellent. Well, that's a great place to wrap. We'll have more information for everybody following the announcement and full release of some upcoming products in next week's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Thanks again for joining us for this week's episode. Quick reminder to catch us on all your favorite podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. See you all next week. Not a little,